and I have the absolute honour and privilege of being the moderator for this session. So the purpose and topic for today's session is cognition. What is it? How does it develop? And today you'll hear from two of the outstanding experts in the field, who I'm sure are known to most of you, and that's Dr. Theo Dawson and Aiden Thornton. So I'll start with a quick intro for those of you who don't know them so well, and then I'll take you through the process that we're going to be going through for the session. We will be recording today's session, and that'll be available for viewing on Lectica's YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be identified, then post any comments or questions in the chat function, because only those who speak will be on the recording. So to the short intros. So the pleasure of introducing Dr. Theo Dawson. Give us a wave. Thanks, Theo. Theo is the Executive Director, CEO and founder of Lectica. Theo is an award-winning cognitive developmental psychologist, and since 1995, her work is focused on documenting conceptual and skill development across the human lifespan. Findings from her research have informed the design of educational tools and technologies that really make it possible to customise and really importantly, optimise learning for everyone. Theo said to me recently that, you know, she and Lectica just want to help the world think better, and God knows we need that. Aiden, if you can just give a wave. So Aiden Thornton is a leadership scientist and a leadership consultant. In his role as leadership scientist, Aiden recently shared his PhD findings on developmental models, and there's a number of us in the room here who were privy to be part of that series of lectures, and there'll be some publications soon around that. So he shared his findings on those developmental models, the complexity gap and longitudinal growth via the Lectica Institute. And as a leadership consultant, he runs a boutique management consulting practice based here in Melbourne, focused on integrative approaches to executive and leadership development. So folks, you're in very, very good and outstandingly capable hands this morning, and we really hope you enjoy the session. Let me give you a quick overview. So Theo and Aiden have proposed 6 questions around the topic of cognition, what it is and how does it develop. We'll share those questions with you shortly. Once we show you the questions, Aiden will do a short presentation, maybe about 10 or 15 minutes, broadly across those 6 questions. And then we'll go into each question where Theo and Aiden will give their views, their knowledge, their understanding on each question. And we'll focus on a question for about 20 minutes. So what will happen is that they'll share their views on question 1, then we'll have some Q&A time, about 5 or 6 minutes after each question, and then we'll go to question 2, question 3, and so forth. So there'll be 6 rounds. So as the panel are discussing the questions, if you could post any questions that you have in the chat function, and I'll facilitate passing those questions and maybe theming them onto Aiden and or Theo, whoever would like to respond to that. There may be some questions that you'll post that might be more relevant, like if we're discussing question 1, that might be more relevant to question 3. So we'll hold those off until we get to question 3. And there may well be some questions that aren't answered, but we'll make sure that we capture them, and in some way, shape or form, maybe through a blog that Theo writes, we'll try and make sure that all your questions are answered. So if, Aiden, I think you have the questions, so it might be time now to share your screen and post those. Give us a quick look at the questions, and then over to you, Aiden, to take us through your short presentation.
Actually, do you have the questions handy that you can share, or do you want me to pull them up on my end?
I've got a PDF, but I thought you wish I can call up.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, just give me a second.
Where is it all?
Do you want to regale us with your PhD stuff in the meantime, Aiden?
Oh, sure, that'll take about 30 seconds, yes. That's right. That's right.
Aiden, when do we get to call you doctor?
Oh, look, I'm sure it's just going to be moments away. You'll be the first to know.
Wouldn't it be good if it happened as we're on this call? Okay, I think I'm good to go.
That's right.
Can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay. So here are the 6 questions. What is cognition and how does it develop? Do you want to take it from here, Aiden? And do you also want me to put up your slides, or are you doing that?
Yeah, that's fine. I've got that. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
So the 6 questions. Can everyone hear me okay, first of all? Yeah, okay, perfect. All right, so the 6 questions we've laid out for today. So question 1, what is your conception of cognition and what has led you to adopt this conception? Question 2, how would you describe the evolution of academic conceptions of cognition over the last century? Question 3, how does your conception of cognition differ from other conceptions of cognition that are currently held in the adult development community? Some interesting discussion there, no doubt. Question 4, is it important for the adult development community to share a conception of cognition? Why or why not? Question 5, what develops in cognitive development? And question 6, which developmental models align with Lectica's approach to cognitive development? So they'll form the focus of our discussion today. And as Deb said, I might present some ideas for the next 10 to 15 minutes or so that might kickstart some considerations, and then Theo and I can get into more of a dialogue and receive some questions from everybody else, if that sounds okay. Super. Alrighty, so I might share my screen. Whoops. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay? Perfect. Alrighty. So what's your conception of cognition and what's led you to adopt this conception? Well, there's kind of a short version of the answer and then a kind of a longer version of the answer. So the short version of my answer would be, my conception of cognition goes something like this. It's any biological, psychological, or behavioral process that emerges from the activity of the neural network. And that includes, but most certainly is not limited to, rational thought. So let me provide you with a bit of background as to where this conception comes from. And we'll take some of these considerations in a historical sequence. So, whoops. There we go. Okay, so first of all, Kohlberg in the 1980s wrote, by reasoning, we meet a rather inclusive form of meaning making, which reunites what a person thinks, feels, and does. And here Kohlberg was referring to Piaget's work from the 1960s when he wrote about structuralism, in which he was talking about kind of cognition being a structural whole. Later on, Stiles in 1999 wrote, as others have stated, intelligence is not simply cognitive in nature, it is affective and conative as well. It involves emotional, motivational, and volitional aspects. In fact, it is merely for convenience to try to handle complexity that we separate these aspects. In practice, they are inseparable. The inseparability of emotion, motivation, and rational thinking in human behavior, the need to erase what Damasio called the Cartesian error, is underscored in current work in the area of neurophysiology and neuropsychology. As we seek to integrate measurement and theory once more, we need to integrate theories of intelligence with affective aspects of cognition. And finally, Fisher and his collaborators in 2006 said, cognitive and emotional development combine with brain development in a collaboration connecting neural networks with actions, feelings, and thoughts. There is no separation of nature and nurture, biology and environment, or brain and behavior, but only a collaborative coordination between them. So as many of you will no doubt know, quite a lot has been said about cognition over the past 100 years, particularly since the 1950s, which kind of marked the cognitive revolution, as it's affectionately called. And so many of the ideas that I'll be presenting to you just now, and many of the ideas that we'll be discussing, are really based on this kind of integrative conception of cognition that goes well beyond just thinking alone. So in trying to address the question around what my conception of cognition is and what's led you to this, really my conception of cognition is really not any different to the way that contemporary cognitive developmentalists would conceive of cognition. This was a model that was put forward by Mascolo and Fisher in 2010 And there's quite a lot of detail in here. Naturally, we won't be able to cover off on all of these particular elements. But for anyone who's interested, we'll provide you with a reference list so you can look up some more information. But just as a brief overview here, there's a couple of things that I wanted to point out. So here, we've essentially got goal-directed action directed towards both internal and external objects. And the essential idea here is that action is mediated by meaning and typically goal-directed. So for example, if we take the action of turning up to a seminar or a dialogue on what is cognition, right? That's an action that you've taken. And that action is probably, to some extent, based on some kind of goal that you have as a result of your executive control. Maybe it's the goal of learning a bit more about cognition. Maybe it's the goal of hearing some alternative perspectives on cognition, or sharing your own perspective, or hearing some contrasting views. It's also informed by the meaning that you attribute to some of these ideas, maybe the meaning that you attribute to adult development, the meaning that you attribute to cognition, the meaning that you attribute to participating in the adult development community, and so forth. But similarly, there's also interaction between a multitude of psychological processes, particularly including things like appraisal, feeling, and motivation. So for example, you've appraised whether or not this session is worth coming to. You've appraised, do these guys really know what they're talking about? You've appraised whether this is a convenient time for you to turn up. You probably had some feelings, maybe some feelings of excitement or curiosity or apprehension about attending the session and so forth. And you've also been spurred on by certain motives, maybe a motive to, foster your own knowledge in the area of cognitive development, or to test some of your thinking and so forth. And all of these things are interacting in a very dynamic way in terms of informing your choice of action. And there's a very meaningful sense in which many of these things, possibly all of these things, could be considered elements of cognition. And I think that really, that when we think about this more integrative conception of cognition, in my mind, there are at least three main arguments in support of this conception. The first argument is a more phenomenological argument, that for many of us, maybe not for all of us, but for many of us, when we inquire into our own phenomenological experience, what we often notice is that thoughts, feelings, motivations, and all of these kind of psychological phenomena tend to co-arise, that anytime we notice a thought, it always tends to be accompanied by feelings or motivations and reflections and so forth. And in fact, a lot of the contemplative literature, for example, talks about this idea of, unity of consciousness and so forth, where these divisions or these boundaries between thought and emotion, between subject and object and so forth, tend to dissolve. The second main argument is more of a psychological argument, and that is in psychological research that the influence of thought and emotion on action or our behavioral performance is almost inseparable. So for example, even in studies that try to assess thinking in particular, or rational thinking, like IQ tests or tests of cognitive complexity, that almost invariably our performance on these tests is also impacted by our emotional state, our motivation, our context, and so on and so forth. So it seems to be almost impossible for tests that are trying to tap rational thinking to just isolate rational thinking from other components of the human condition. And I think the third argument in support of this is a neuroscience argument. And I've got a long list of quotes here. I won't go through all of them, but maybe I'll just draw your attention to the third one I've got on this slide. But certainly over the past 10, say 20 years or so, there seems to be an increasingly integrative conception of cognition. And so if I just draw your attention to this third bullet point here from 2015, the distinction between emotional and the cognitive brain is fuzzy and context dependent. Indeed, there is compelling evidence that brain territories and psychological processes commonly associated with cognition, such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and working memory, play a central role in emotion. Furthermore, putatively emotional and cognitive regions influence one another via a complex web of connections in ways that jointly contribute to adaptive and maladaptive behavior. This work demonstrates that emotion and cognition are deeply interwoven in the fabric of the brain, suggesting that widely held beliefs about the key constituents of the emotional brain and the cognitive brain are fundamentally flawed. So you can see here that there's kind of a sort of a building case here based on these phenomenological considerations, psychological considerations, and neuropsychological considerations, that it becomes increasingly challenging to think about cognition as kind of isolating thought at the expense of all of these other equally important psychological processes. So in terms of the way that the evolution of academic conceptions have evolved, there are a couple of considerations here. And I'm certainly just offering this as a heuristic or a way of organizing information, certainly not as a theory of cognition. But generally what we see in the literature is there tends to be more narrow models of cognition, where cognition is identified with purely rational thinking. And this is the kind of conception that we sometimes see in particular adult development circles, for example. We have some more intermediate models of cognition, where cognition consists of more of an interrelated cluster of processes that typically include things like perception, information processing, information storage, information retrieval, pattern recognition, rational thought. There's probably a few other things we could add in there, language acquisition, and so on and so forth. And this is the kind of conception that often gets taught in clinical psychology programs, for example. And then finally, we've got more integrative models of cognition, where cognition is conceived to consist of any biological, psychological, or behavioral phenomena that emerge from the activity of the neural network. And in this kind of conception, we do include thinking, but we're also extending that to meaning, to motivation, to action, and so forth. And this is the kind of integrative conception that we tend to see in neo-Piagetians and also increasingly in neuroscience as well. So, in terms of the way that this kind of conception may differ from other conceptions that are held by the adult development community, one of the adult development models that I'm very interested in is ego development, and it's a topic that I've done some relatively extensive research on. Maybe we can have a conversation about that sometime. Some of us already have, and some of us will continue that dialogue. So just to contrast the cognitive developmentalists' conception of cognition with an ego developmentalist's conception of cognition, there's a couple of thoughts that I wanted to share here. So typically in ego development, some of the most significant ego developmentalists, being Lovinger, Talbot, and Cook-Greuter, have typically said that the ego is the overarching construct within which a number of other things fit. And so Lovinger, for example, talked about ego development consisting of impulse control, interpersonal style, conscious preoccupations, and cognitive style. Talbot, for example, talked about ego development consisting of cognitive style, interpersonal style, and mode of ethical awareness. And then Greuter as a more behavioral dimension, an affective dimension, and a cognitive dimension. What you'll see in here in all three cases is that cognition is perceived to be one of several things that is subsumed by ego development. And in Greuter's dissertation from 1999, she specifically says that the cognitive dimension is one of three main dimensions of ego development, with an emphasis on conceptions, the construction of knowledge, and interpretation. So there's probably sound reasons to think that for ego developmentalists, cognition appears to be one of several constructs subsumed by ego development. However, in stark contrast to this, for some cognitive developmentalists, clearly not all, but for some cognitive developmentalists, ego development is totally cognitive, precisely because it does strive to integrate thought, emotion, and action, because they are in fact inseparable elements of an integrative conception of cognition. And hopefully in the conversation, this is more than just playing around with words and definitions and so forth. This is actually quite an important distinction that I hope we can get through in our dialogue. And yet another distinction that sometimes gets made in the adult development community is this one around lines and levels, and the way that some adult developmentalists talk about cognition is as a line that develops through developmental levels. And the challenge with this, though, is that this is inconsistent with empirical evidence to suggest that cognition, as a whole, is at a developmental level. And so increasingly, I think the way that cognitive developmentalists have started to think about this topic is to say that, well, cognition is a set of biological and psychological processes. And we've talked about some of those emergent properties, including things such as thought, emotion, motivation, action, and so forth. And that what cognition allows us to do is a whole variety of different things. One of the things that we're interested in, and Lectica is interested in certainly, is the kind of reasoning that we can do in different domains. For example, we might set about doing some reasoning in the moral domain. We might set about doing reasoning in the reflective judgment domain, or in the self-concept domain, for instance. And of course, there's a lot of overlap and interaction between these knowledge domains. But in this particular context, cognition wouldn't necessarily be conceived as a discrete line that develops through developmental levels. Rather, it would be a process that underpins emergent psychological properties, including, but not limited to, our ability to reason. And reasoning almost certainly recruits processes of thought, emotion, meaning, and motivation. So finally, so is it important for the adult development community to share a conception of cognition, and why? Well, my position on that is, of course, it's not absolutely essential, but I do think it's desirable, because as many of you know, going back to 1982 and 1983, there was nothing short of an academic war that happened between Kohlberg and Loevinger. And I think that in many ways, these two very important scholars were actually talking through each other because they had such different conceptions of cognition. So just to give you an example of this, this is an extract from Cook-Groder's writing in 2013. So ego development theory is consciously looking at the whole person and does so in a comprehensive way. Not surprisingly, most research in the field of constructive developmental theory focuses on cognitive aspects of development and the complexity of reasoning about whatever test makers present as stimuli and tasks. She goes on to say that the cognitive component addresses the question of how a person thinks and reasons about him or herself and the world. But I think that this kind of conception of cognition comes with a number of risks. So the first risk is that it may risk mischaracterizing the way in which cognitive developmentalists have consistently described their own conception of cognition. I don't think that there's many cognitive developmentalists who've ever said that they would constrain their conception of cognition to thinking alone. And again, dating back to Piaget in the 1960s, to Kohlberg in the 1980s, there's always been this more inclusive form of cognition, which includes meaning-making, thought, emotion, and action. And secondly, I think the risk here is that it may risk accepting the conclusion that cognitive developmentalists can actually isolate thinking at the expense of other aspects of the human condition, so that we can actually, isolate thought at the expense of meaning, emotion, and action. And this seems to be almost conceptually and empirically impossible. And not only that, but it also seems to be vastly inconsistent with what we've learned through empirical evidence. So just to provide you with a brief example of that, there's again a lot of information on this page, but I'll just draw your attention to a couple of key elements. This is an example of how the complexity of reasoning changes over the course of a psychotherapy session. Again, this comes from a publication from Moscolo and Fisher in 2010, and I direct you to that particular article if you're interested in learning some more. But just very briefly, there's two things that I wanted to point out. The first thing I wanted to point out is this is a bit of an indication as to what feelings were being felt by the therapy client through the session, from positive feelings to embarrassment to depression and sadness and anxiety and fear. And this gray line here is an indication of the complexity of their reasoning throughout the session. And one of the conclusions that these researchers reached is that the complexity of reasoning is certainly partially varying as a function of emotion, of emotional conditions. So if it was the case that these kind of indicators of complexity were just isolating thought and ignoring emotion, we wouldn't get these kind of results, right? So we can see that emotion is very much playing a role in determining the complexity of reasoning that's accessible to someone moment by moment. So with that being said and done, it took a little bit longer than I expected, so sorry about that. So I'll just stop screen sharing and we can talk. How's that sound?
Sounds good, Aiden. So before we go into the specific questions, we have had a general question from Jaroslav, and I'd like you to just quickly give an answer to this. It's a definitional answer. What and who is the adult development community?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, and Theo, if you'd like to pipe in, you're welcome.
Yeah, maybe Theo can go first because I've been
Okay, Theo, you go first.
I'm happy. I'd like to hear Aiden characterize the adult development community.
Well, I think the adult development community is pretty broad. I mean, I think if we look at what are the adult development models that are currently being applied, I mean, I would include cognitive developmentalists, I would include ego developmentalists, I would include people who are interested in spiral dynamics, I would include, people who are interested in things like reinventing organizations, for example. I would include people who are interested in the way that aspects of the human condition develop in a stage-like way.
And I would add that there are really two adult development communities. There's a community of people that are actually doing work around this in the academy. And then there's the business of adult development, and that also is part of the adult development community. And it's easy to kind of blur those lines, and it's not always clear, whether the message is a marketing message or it's a message that's coming out of academic research. So that's important to kind of keep that in mind.
Yeah, thank you. And Aiden, you may not be aware of this at this point, but apparently Barrett Brown has advised that you'll actually be doing a second dissertation on this question. So maybe you better get to work. Let's go to...
There actually is work underway on other aspects of adult development, including the subject-object interview and other bits and pieces as well. So we can talk about that other stuff sometime. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
All right. So let's go to question 1, which is, what is your conception of cognition and what has led you to adopt this conception? So Theo, let's hear from you first, because we've heard some of what Aiden will say, and no doubt he'll elaborate a bit more on this particular question. So over to you.
Would you put each question in the chat as we go? Because I'm really worried I'll just start answering them all. Yeah. I don't have a real clear guidepost.
So I'll just do them one at a time, yeah?
Yes, because otherwise I'll probably...
Rather than all 6. Yeah.
Just one.
Yeah. Will do.
And I promise I'll try to stay on course. So now I asked Aiden to present all of those slides up front, because I think that they make a fantastic introduction and kind of set the stage for the rest of the conversation that we're going to be happening this evening. We're sorry, there was supposed to be 3 of us here. You probably all saw an advertisement saying that Clint was also going to be joining us, but he was unable to because there's an illness in the family. So we're missing him tonight, but hopefully he'll be back with us next time. So my conception of cognition, like Aiden's, comes out of originally out of the Piagetian tradition, that cognitive developmental tradition, that very particular one. Not that it was completely isolated to that, because there's been quite a bit of really quite good work on cognition coming from other disciplines. And of course you have to weave in the good work wherever you find it. But I've clung to the Piagetian tradition because I think that more than any other way of thinking about how cognition works, it continues for me to keep jiving with what we actually see when we are looking at people and performances and growth, and the way that the things that make learning work and the things that make learning not work. There's still so much that that I learned from Piaget that I can say, yes, absolutely, you were right. And now I think what's so fascinating is that the neuroscience community is finally doing research where they're confirming many of the things that Piaget had to say about cognition, but with no window into the brain at all, just from a lot of intensive observation over a long period of time. So we see the work that we're doing here as building on that conception of cognition, and I think Aiden did a great job of laying that out. Other traditions that have appealed to me, there have been some other traditions around learning that I feel like have provided little bits and pieces, and I would even include some of the really early behaviorist work that was done gave us some clues about things that that have helped me to understand learning better. But really, it's the Piagetian tradition that we lean on the most heavily, and of course now increasingly on neuroscience.
Thanks, Theo. Aiden, did you want to add something to that?
No, I mean I'm on board with all of those considerations. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else that I can say particularly with respect to that. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to question 2, which is, how would you describe, and I'll put this in the chat window in just a moment, how would you describe the evolution of academic conceptions of cognition over the last century? So,
do we have actually, Deb, sorry to interrupt, just 1 second. I just wondered whether we had any questions or comments or challenges from the audience about either Theo's response to question 1 or my response to question 1.
not so far. It looks like everyone's on board, but if anyone would like to take themselves off mute and pose a question, now's your opportunity.
Yeah, I have a question, and Aiden, Theo, I appreciate the nuanced definition that you're bringing of cognition, and certainly recognize the simplicity of sort of a states and stages model. And what I'm curious about is, I'm assuming that there's still structural development that's happening in cognition, even if we're not calling it sort of a line developing through stages. Does anybody know about the latest research around the structural development that happens in the brain that correlates with the structural development that you're referring to regarding cognition?
I think that Aiden started to speak to that. There's quite a bit of research that's being done right now on what's called the connectome in neuroscience.
Right, you've talked about that before.
Aiden was actually talking about that research in one of the quotes that he mentioned. And that in that particular strand of research in neuroscience, they're the folks who kind of made the discovery that from the brain's point of view, it's about connections. So the structure is the connections that are made and how those connections relate to other connections that are made in different parts of the brain. And what they're finding is that brains that work best in real life, brains that can solve problems better, make decisions better, that are clearer, that represent a clearer thinker, are brains that are more connected across more different parts of the brain. So if you can imagine, I mean, that's a kind of way of thinking about the structure of development. The way that we originally were thinking about the structure of development has more been in terms of what we can actually observe. So there's looking at what's actually happening in the brain, and then there's what you can observe through behavior. And Piaget posited some theories about what was going on in the brain, and then tried to find evidence in behavior of what was going on in the brain. And that's how he got to his definitions of structure, is by doing those observations. And that took him to understand, something that's very like the dopamine opioid cycle that happens in our brain, something that, that he actually had a mechanism that just maps directly onto that dopamine opioid cycle as a consequence purely of doing behavioral research and really thinking about, what structures would be there if, we see this kind of development taking place. And we have our own way of thinking about structure here when we think about scoring, which is, again, it's another way of thinking about structure as well. Go ahead, Aiden.
Yeah, no, so I totally agree with all of that. I mean, I would just build on that as well by saying, so in response to Barrett's question, there's almost certainly structural development happening. But I think what we're saying is that rather than attributing stages to the whole of cognition, that stages are better attributed to discrete reasoning skills. And that seems to be more consistent with the empirical evidence. And also, I read an article probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I have to dig up the actual reference because I can't quite remember the title of the article or the authors, but I know I've got it saved. But they were a group of neuroscientists who are actually using the concept of hierarchical complexity to characterize certain structural features of the brain. Now, their conception of hierarchical complexity was not identical to Lectica's conception, but they were certainly very related. And so it really, I got the strong impression that there really is this sense that neuroscientists are really substantiating a lot of those behavioral observations that Theo was just talking about. Yeah.
I also think that there's this difference, and Aiden, we struggle with this all the time, between learning and how learning works, and how you talk about what you're observing from a developmental point of view. And I think we've come up with this notion of stages because it fits certain observations that we were making. Those original observations of Baldwin, that people just don't think the same way when they're teenagers as they did when they were young children, and they just don't think the same way they did when they were teenagers when they become adults. And they began to see there were real qualitative differences. And as we refined our understanding of those, we came to think of them as stages and qualitative changes. But those are explanations that humans are making about phenomena they're observing. I don't know if we can make the claim that there's something purely analogous in the brain that relates to those changes.
Right.
And I think that's what
my understanding of the connectome research is they already kind of encountered this, and it's kind of coming from a theory standpoint. They can model these networks, but then mapping the purely theoretical network onto the biological network, and they're having issues. So it's a theory model in search of an application. I think
we're way far. Yeah, these two sciences have not come together yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Far apart from one another. And in our focus, we've created a metric that measures developmental level, but our focus is increasingly on structures with respect to how learning happens. Like, how do we build up that healthy connectome that's going to support continued growth and development? And they're not disconnected from one another, but I think that we've got definitely a shift from caring a lot about stages to caring a whole lot more about how do people develop? How do we develop? And that's where the model of, everything working together to support development together. Yeah. And Robert, will you wait to be called on?
No,
he's had to leave.
He had to leave. Okay.
There's a couple more questions in the chat function there. I'm going to leave them to one of the other questions, so we will get to them. But just on that last point around learning, I would like to go to Robert's question. Does a more integrative definition of cognition demand a more integrative definition of learning, thinking, feeling, doing, habit change, encoding, consolidation?
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick answer to that before we go on to question 2?
I would say that's what we're all about.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, that's why the best learning experiences do that very thing, that they get us to think about stuff, to feel stuff, to construct meaning about things, to act on things, to reflect. Absolutely. Yeah, that's how robust knowledge gets constructed and networked within our neural network. So most certainly it does. Yeah.
And what we mean by embodied learning is that it's whole person learning, so that what you've learned is not just connected to another idea, but it's connected to feelings, it's connected to body sensations. It's deeply wired.
Let's move on to question 2, which is in the chat function, and that is, how would you describe the evolution of academic conceptions of cognition over the last century? And if we can incorporate into that Becky's question, how is academia looking at collective cognition? That would be helpful. So Theo, would you give us your view on that, and then we'll go to Aiden.
Oh, I thought Aiden was first on this one. Did we?
No,
Conception of cognition. I can go. That's okay.
Okay.
I can go. Just let me read the question again.
So, how would you describe the evolution of academic conceptions of cognition over the last century?
Oh yeah, that's one of the smaller questions that we decided that we would deal with.
Yes.
So I'm not going to try to do anything really comprehensive here, but I would say that there have been several parallel research disciplines in this area over the last century and more. And that, so the behaviorist school was only willing to actually look at actual behaviors that you could observe. And so that entire school of understanding about cognition was related to behavior that is observable.
Yeah.
And there's, of course, other traditions, including the cognitive developmental tradition, and then the psychodynamic traditions in which cognition was characterized, and again, in a very different kind of a way. What's interesting is that the behavioral tradition actually started to merge with the cognitive developmental tradition, and create a kind of little offshoot in like the 1950s, 1960s. So there, it's like multiple networks of these different strands going off in different directions. I think one of the most dramatic changes of the last 30 years is that the academy has actually pretty much abandoned big theory, which means that Piagetian theory and cognitive developmental theory, the really deep stuff, the rich stuff, the stuff we're building on, is no longer available in most universities. And there are very few surviving researchers who are working in that arena, that we've moved away from theory almost completely to focus on just like little tiny tidbits of things. You're allowed to study one tiny little area, but you're not allowed to have a big theory about things. So that's my short little take. Aiden, I'm sure you've got lots to contribute here.
Yeah, no, it's right. I mean, I agree with all of that. And as I said before, my heuristic around the more narrow conception of cognition, the intermediate and the more integrative. I think in some ways it's seductive to think about that as a historical kind of pattern, and I'm not necessarily sure that that's consistently true. My sense is that the empirical evidence has certainly led us to more integrative conception of cognition. But having said that, I still see the narrow conception of cognition and the intermediate conception of cognition being used very, very frequently. I mean, for example, I was just in a university bookstore the other day and picked up a textbook about cognition. And the way that they were thinking about cognition was in the most narrow possible sense, that it was all about thought, as if all of this other empirical evidence hadn't really happened. So I'm kind of wondering whether or not there's a disconnect between what the direction that the empirical evidence is taking us and the way that a lot of people are still conceiving of cognition. And that kind of concerns me in a way, right? Because it firstly, I think there's a conceptual problem leading people to this false conclusion that you can really isolate thought. But secondly, and I think more importantly, when it comes to developing, leader development programs and, educational curricula and so forth, it's so important to take that embodied approach, which actually integrates, meaning making and emotion and motivation and all of those kind of things. And I worry that some of those things drop off the agenda when we conceive of cognition in the most narrow possible way. You see where I'm going?
Well, I think that's exactly the same thing that I'm pointing to, is that instead of embracing a broader theory and trying to bring all of the evidence together, the way that the community has gone is to break it apart into tiny little elements, and everybody's got their own little theory about their own little narrow piece. With no attempt to try to bring the big picture together, or with little. And it's really interesting that that's happening in neuroscience right now.
Yeah.
That it had to happen in neuroscience because it got abandoned by the research community, the behavioral research community. Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the pendulum next.
Yeah. No, I really agree. And I mean, this is probably starting to get into our next question a little bit, but I do worry that when we talk about cognition, as cognitive developmentalists, or even just as an adult development community, that we often do end up speaking through each other. And there's not necessarily a meeting of the minds. I mean, I've heard a number of people say, for example, oh, well, what Lectica does is only cognitive. And I have to kind of respond by saying, but what are all of these non-cognitive things that you think people are doing? I mean, what are all of these things that you think are independent of the neural network? So I think it's, to the extent that we want to communicate in a meaningful way about these things, I think it actually is really important for us to kind of push that more integrative conception of cognition, because I think it really does do the work far more justice,
But do you think, Aiden, that there's some value of trying to break these things down into categories for the purpose of being able to isolate them and to be able to study them as isolated things? Or do you think that it's time to abandon that way of doing it altogether?
Well, I think both of those things could be useful in different contexts. I'm just not necessarily sure that they can be separated in a meaningful way. I mean, they're so interdependent. So, a lot of the neuroscience research is showing that there are certain hubs that occur in the brain where, things that were previously conceived of as cognitive and things that were previously conceived of as emotional are so interconnected that they're just virtually inseparable. So I think that, my sense is we can talk about these things as if they were separable in certain contexts. We could maybe talk about meaning making, or we could maybe talk about thinking, we could maybe talk about, rational thought and so forth, as if it was a separate thing. But in reality, I think we've always got to remind ourselves and come back to that big picture about the interconnectedness of this stuff. That would be my sense, but what's your sense around that?
Well, I mean, there probably are some kinds of decent reasons for breaking them apart. The weather is a major systemic phenomenon, but it really helps that we can measure temperature separately from wind.
Right.
So there might be those kinds of reasons for doing it.
Right.
But I think doing it in a context where you're trying to understand the whole is what's really key there. It's like, I understand that I've created these categories. They're not out there.
Yeah.
I've created these categories to make it easier to achieve X or Y. And I think that's what gets forgotten or never learned, that we just never get to the point where we really understand that that's the case. And I see a lot of research where that seems to have been completely forgotten. And the big picture just isn't looked at all. But I am encouraged by the neuroscience phenomenon, because I think it's going to create the demand to understand this better in terms of behavior. And neuroscience can't do that piece. So we're going to get back in vogue again. It's going to happen.
Well, I think as well that, to some extent, this claim that, reasoning is mostly thinking at the expense of all of this kind of stuff. In some ways, I feel like it's not really within the purview for developmentalists to really be commenting on that in a way. I mean, at the end of the day, the only thing that developmentalists have access to is behavior, whether that's sensory motor actions in childhood, or whether that's verbal behavior in adulthood. We can't peer into people's minds. We don't know whether they're mostly recruiting their thinking skills or mostly recruiting their emotional skills. The only thing that we have access to are the behaviors that people produce. So in some ways, I almost feel as if this is an area where developmentalists need to not necessarily defer to, but almost kind of hand over to neuroscience to establish some of those things.
That's a really good point. There's one dimension here that we haven't talked about yet, and I think because it's such a big part of what we do, we probably should bring it in before too long. And that is that our mission is an educational mission here. We believe that we need to radically change the educational system so that we are actually allowing people to learn the way their brains are designed to learn. And the current educational system is really based upon this idea that cognition is separate from everything else. Now, there's a lot of lip service giving to understand that things are connected, but the way it's structured, what's valued, what's being valued, what's being tested is that kind of idea that you can store facts in the brain and you can spit facts back out again, that you can be completely rational in your thinking. All of those things are still being sold in the educational system, despite the fact that all of the evidence is against, any idea that it works that way at this point. We know better than that at this point.
Okay, I think what we'd like to do is move on to question 2. There are some other questions in the chat room. Ron, I'd like to get to yours when we get to question 3, and Barrett to your first question when we get to question 5. So, but let's move on for now to question 2. And maybe this is a shorter piece because there's some other very, very juicy questions as we get past question 3. But question 2 is, how would you describe the evolution of academic conceptions of cognition over the last century? Aiden, would you like to comment on that first?
I think we've said all we can about that. I think we should
move on.
Yeah.
Anything else from you, Theo?
I think we've probably overdone it a little bit on this one.
We got a bit excited. Sorry, Dev.
That's absolutely fine. Just wanting to make sure we're ticking those boxes. So let's move on to question 3. And I'll put that in the chat window in just a moment. The question is, how does your conception of cognition differ from other conceptions of cognition that are currently held in the adult community? So what I'd like you to do is each of you respond to that, and then Ron has a specific question that I'd like you to address once you've given that overview. So Aiden, would you like to go first on that one?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I've already started to provide somewhat of a response around that, particularly by contrasting cognitive developmental conceptions and ego development conceptions. I think that my sense is the way that cognitive developmentalists have thought about this has probably changed a bit, over the past decade. So, for example, if you go back and read Kohlberg's work from 1982 and 1983, he actually does say that ego development is kind of a higher order construct, and Piagetian stages and Kohlbergian stages and everything fit into this broader conception of ego. But I think, after the 1980s, as things have progressed, my sense is that cognitive developmentalists have really let go of that idea. And that in fact, all of those things that ego developmentalists were talking about, namely thought, emotion, action, and meaning making, are all simply different facets of cognition. I think that probably cognitive developmentalists are relatively agnostic as to whether or not there is an ego, there is such a thing as an ego that synthesizes all of that other stuff. I don't think that cognitive developmentalists would necessarily object to the idea that there's an ego that plays that kind of synthetic function. But at the same time, I don't think that cognitive developmentalists really require one either. A number of cognitive developmental theories talk about or describe their theories as being non-mentalistic. And by non-mentalistic, they're trying not to make assumptions about certain facets of the mind, or that there are certain properties of the mind. So my sense is that the way that a lot of other adult development theorists think about cognition is in a relatively narrow sense, that cognition ought to be constrained to thinking and rational thought. Whereas the way that cognitive developmentalists have thought about cognition since, the 1950s, 1960s has always been a more integrative kind of conception. And I do think that that's a very important distinction, and a distinction that would be good to work through with other adult development communities.
That's so interesting, Aiden, because those communities argue that we have the narrow conception.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And so why aren't they right about that? I mean,
yeah.
Why are we more correct in the way that we think about it than they are correct in the way that they think about it, if we're both asserting
right
that we have the more holistic conception?
Yeah. Well, indeed. Yeah.
It's the I think that it comes down to evidence, right? In the end, it comes down to where the evidence goes, where the evidence takes you. But there are also, these human desires and proclivities that we have that draw us toward the ego development framework as well. It's very popular.
Yeah.
People like it. They like that kind of holism, or what's called holism in that tradition. They like the idea that everything centers around the ego, and not something that's separated from the discussion of the self per se.
So can
Right.
you comment then on...
Let me just say one quick thing, sorry, and then I'll hand over to you. Sorry, Deb. I think there's an important distinction there, right? Because what ego developmentalists appear to be claiming is that their model takes account of thought, feeling, meaning-making, action, and motivation, right? Cognitive developmentalists also claim that their model takes account of those exact same things. The difference is that a score on an ego development test is attributed to the whole person, whereas a score on a cognitive developmental test is attributed to a reasoning skill. And I think this is where things are starting to get a bit confused and conflated about. They're both equally integrative, I think, in terms of the types of psychological functions that are being taken account by both models. It's just that ego development seems to be making a claim about a whole person, whereas I think that cognitive developmentalists are making a more modest claim, and dare I say, a more empirically supported claim as well.
Dare you say indeed. So let's look at a question coming from Ron that links to this discussion, I think. What considerations are given to philosophical academic traditions, i.e. Russell, G.E. Moore, to our understanding of cognition?
Is that for me specifically? Should I start?
Could either one of you, respond to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, not those specific individuals that you mentioned. However, I mean, if you look at, the big names in the cognitive revolution since the 1950s, so, if you look at people like Chomsky or Fodor or Daniel Dennett and so forth, then, I mean, certainly there are a great number of philosophical traditions that have been integrated into, I think, the conception of cognition. I'm not so sure about the particular ones that you were mentioning, but maybe Theo's got something more to say about that.
I think for the cognitive developmental tradition, we started with an epistemologist.
Yeah.
That's a philosopher. Piaget was a philosopher. So our tradition has its roots in philosophy. Actually, Baldwin was also a philosopher, and he preceded Piaget. So our tradition has its roots in philosophy, which is pretty true of most psychological theories, I would say. If you look across and you look back far enough, the roots are in philosophical traditions. The thread that runs through the cognitive developmental tradition post Piaget, or in other people who work with Piaget, references Rawls and people like Rawls and Habermas, and my mind is not going to let me come up with all the names because it doesn't like doing names. Dewey and Mead. Those are the names that appear in this tradition more often than other names. Though, when I was in graduate school, people were bringing all sorts of philosophers into the conversation. So,
yeah.
Okay, so shall we, before we move on to question 4, do we want to have a short amount of time, maybe 5 to 7 minutes, for any general comments? There's a couple of people who've posted some more general comments in the chat room. If you want to take yourself off mute, make a comment, or ask a different kind of question, then let's pause for a few minutes to do that.
Just say that I'm deeply appreciating the discussion and the community engagement. And as someone who considers himself more on the practitioner side of the scholar practitioner field and natural passion in that direction, to the extent that we can also be incorporating that aspect that we can take into our work would be super helpful for me.
Yeah, totally.
Barrett, you asked a question that is at the top of the question list that I thought that Aiden might enjoy answering, unless you wanted to postpone that till later. Deborah, am I jumping over something?
Well, it's a big question, and I wasn't really sure where to put it, so I've kind of put it further down the list. But let's have a crack at it now while we're having a pause. You were referring to the big theory question?
Yes, Barrett's question.
Oh, actually, no, actually, I'm much more interested in a different question that I posted earlier.
Oh, you are?
I am.
So we could take that question.
Actually, Barrett's first question is probably more related to question 5. I think what develops in cognitive development. So we might hold off on his first question.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine.
If you're all right, we're all right with that, Barrett. Cool.
Yeah. No, of course. No pressure.
Still, Aiden, if you'd like to tackle that question just for a second, it'd be fine.
So are you talking about the big theory question about postmodernism?
Is that the theory in the academic the result of postmodernism deconstructing meta-narratives, and or is there actually cognitive science that suggests that big theories aren't viable and or some other major driver? Just a minute or so on that.
Look, I could be seduced into talking about that topic for several months, but on the other hand,
that's exactly why I said. Maybe
here's the here's the thing. So actually, next time we actually are talking about postmodernism and whether postmodernism is a developmental stage beyond modernism. So actually, maybe we should defer it till then instead. Yeah.
So watch this space. You've got to come back to the next the session in January, Barrett, to get your answer to that one. All right. So let's move on to question 4, which is it important for the adult development community to share a conception of cognition? And if so, why? And Aiden, you have touched on that, but now that we're kind of up to this question, is there something more that you'd like to say about that?
Well, I mean, look, I think I would just summarize my view on that by saying, is it absolutely essential that all adult developmentalists have the same conception of cognition? Of course it's not. But would it be constructive and would it help us to make more progress than what we've made in the past? I really think it would. And I'm genuinely concerned about the way in which adult developmentalists talk through each other when it comes to cognition, because everyone has such a different conception of it. I think if there really could be a meeting of the minds, then that would require us to agree on some kind of operational definition by what we mean by cognition. And I think the second thing is probably more important. If we're saying that cognition is one of the things that's getting developed stage by stage, then I think we better be clear about what that construct is, right? I mean, if we're saying that something's getting developed, what is the thing that's getting developed? And so as a community of adult developmentalists, I think it is relatively important for us to be clear about what messages we're communicating about what's actually getting developed. So for example, in the ego development tradition, for instance, they're making the claim that it's actually the ego or the worldview that's constructed by the ego that's getting developed stage by stage. That's not a claim that is being made by the cognitive developmentalists. The claim that they're making is that it's, for the most part, mostly reasoning skills that are getting developed stage by stage. And I really think that there's some really thorny issues that we still have to iron out in the adult development community, right? About, different patterns of growth over time and different catalysts of growth and so on and so forth. And I feel as if there could be a much more productive exchange around these really important topics if we could have a relatively consistent conception about what we mean by cognition.
Yeah, thank you. Theo, would you like to add to that?
I'm never really sure how to respond to questions like this one, because there's a part of me that's desperate to have somebody to constructively disagree with.
Have somebody, could you just say that again, Theo?
It's someone to constructively disagree with. So, with a sparring partner that's done their homework and has got a strong research base. When I was in graduate school, there were several strong parallel traditions where, no, we didn't agree completely about how we defined anything, but we respected one another because the reasons that we had different conceptions was because we had this body of evidence that had led us in different directions. And what made my experience so rich was that I could borrow from multiple traditions, and look for commonalities across to kind of test whether what I'm observing through my lens is consistent with what people are seeing through other lenses. So there's a part of me that just really values the possibility of there being multiple conceptions. But on the other hand, and this is how I get myself into big trouble, is that I don't find stupid conceptions very interesting at all. And I would rather there were not any stupid conceptions.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I agree with you on that. So I'm with you on most of those things. So I like the idea of having someone to constructively disagree with. But what I would prefer, though, is if the adult development community could band together and we could constructively disagree with the neuroscientists or the people that are actually doing the actual hands-on research into what the nature of cognition is, for example. I think that would be more constructive than having disagreements amongst the adult development community about what cognition is.
Unfortunately,
are there a few common talking points to rebuff the developmentalists?
Excuse me, it's wait to put your hand up and to ask questions. I don't know who that was, but my thought got interrupted. What was the last thing you said, Aiden?
I just said I would prefer to have the neuroscientists as sparring partners rather than other adult developmentalists.
Yes, I think unfortunately, because the adult development field has gotten so flaky over the last 30 years, the neuroscientists don't really want to talk to us.
Well, that's also a good point.
Yeah.
That's a very valid point.
Yeah.
It's a very valid
So who was making a comment just before? If you could just give me a wave. Who was just making that previous comment? Can't see anyone.
It was Robert. It was Robert.
Oh, it was Robert. Is Robert, are you still here?
I jumped back on, which is why I'm trying to keep my video and sound off. What I was going to ask about is, so I like the points about this. Obviously, if you guys think that you probably rightly have a leg up in the developmental, ego developmental folk, are there some common talking points, refutation points that you could disseminate to us so that these are the common errors they make and these are the things they really need to get straight before they can proceed? Theo, you probably have some strong opinions here.
Oh, it sounds like you've got a crying child in the background.
No. Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the question.
I think, are there any common talking points between the cognitive developmental tradition and the ego development tradition? Yes. Well,
sorry, it wasn't about the common talking points. It was the common refutation points. If you see a bad, if you see XYZ, this is a sign of a bad ego development person, and here's the right retort.
We don't think there are bad people. But
yeah, well, we don't really think there's bad ego development people.
There's weak science. I mean, I think of it more as it being weak science, and sometimes claims being made that are more like marketing than they are like the actually using and thinking with evidence. But I think this is a problem throughout our entire society. It's not exclusive to our field by any stretch, as you all know. That we're in a marketplace right now, or a world stage right now, or a civic environment right now, in which we no longer really have a good handle on how to evaluate content. And nor do we have the skills, most of us, to be able to evaluate content.
I think there's a nice link there.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
I wasn't sure who'd finished. Sorry, Theo, I thought you'd finished. And I was going to say, I think there's a nice link between what we're now focusing on and a question from Ram. And then I'd like to go to an earlier question from Sergio. But the question from Ram is, which brings us to the pragmatic stuff around this, is as a consultant and thinking about it from a client's perspective, how do I help clients make meaning out of the difference between constructive cognitive development and ego development? And does it even matter to them?
Yes, this is something that we're likely to get more into in the roundtable discussions. This one is intended to be just out there in academic land. Yeah. But of course, we have a whole nother parallel series that we're working on where we're dealing with the more practical the more practical implications of this kind of conversation. Do you have something, Aiden, short or pithy?
Short and sweet, Aiden?
I'm sorry, my internet connection was actually just breaking up at the time you were reading out that question, so I actually missed most of it. I apologize.
Okay. We want to have
a question.
a quick answer, because this is more for the round table pragmatic discussions, but just a pithy short answer to the question. As a consultant and thinking about it from a client's perspective, how do I help clients make meaning out of the difference between constructive cognitive development and ego development, and does it even matter to them?
Well, I think it matters. It certainly matters because I think the very similar claims are being made about ego development and cognitive development. And the complaint that ego developmentalists have had about cognitive developmentalists is that they're too narrow because they only focus on thinking skills, which doesn't really seem to be well supported. And the main complaint that the cognitive developmentalists have had about the ego developmentalists is that their stages don't actually increase in complexity. So they can't, the ego development stages can't really be used to characterize increasingly complex capabilities. And by the way, that is a conclusion that my PhD dissertation has overwhelmingly supported, but maybe we can talk about that some other time. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's really, really important, because if you're working with complexity, if your goal is to help leaders thrive in complexity, then you need to be working with a theory and an assessment that actually taps complexity. And my view, strongly supported by empirical evidence, is that ego development is not accomplishing that.
And just really quickly, there's also a no answer to this, and that is that there's something that feels very destructive and is feeling increasingly destructive to me about focusing on the stages at all.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's just another thing. You'll see us. We hardly talk about stages at all anymore, except in contexts where they really matter, like recruitment or like those kinds of measurements. What we're talking more about now is, what do you need to do to grow? What are the things you need to do to grow? What are the actions we need to take to grow, the behaviors we need to engage in, the practices that will leverage how the brain really works in order to help us to just keep growing throughout our lives? That's the thing that's going to make us more able to deal with the complexity we face.
Well, let's move back to the academic realm with this question. And I'm hoping, I'm not even too sure who to field this to. So this is from Sergio. How does non-mentalistic relate to the phenomenological perspective? It feels pragmatically you need a hub for multiple inferential processes to influence each other. And from a distance, one group calls it cognition and another ego. Is that fair? Maybe what motivates the usage of cognition is avoidance of mentalisticness. Aiden, would you like to have a go at answering that?
Well, I can give it a shot. There's a lot in that to unpack. I'm not quite sure that I understand all the aspects of that question, but we'll give it a go. I think it's a worthy question. So by saying non-mentalistic, we wouldn't even need to take a phenomenological perspective. I mean, so by talking about phenomenology, what we're talking about is our subjective experience, the qualia that goes on in the privacy of our own mind. By talking about non-mentalistic, we're saying that we're not assuming that a person has a mind. We're not assuming that a person has an internal world. So if we were to take a non-mentalistic perspective, then the phenomenological perspective probably becomes less relevant. What I was talking about, when it feels pragmatically, you need a hub for months. I'm not sure that I quite understand that. I think in relation to, cognition versus ego, is it just two different names for the same thing? I don't think it is, actually. So the way that ego developmentalists talk about the ego is that it is the process of synthesizing. It's basically, it is the synthetic function of the self. And I don't think that that's necessarily quite the same claim that cognitive developmentalists are making. So I think there are some important distinctions between the two. The cognitive developmentalists are making the claim that there is a bunch of psychological and behavioral processes that emerge from the dynamic interactions that happen in the neural network. I think that what the ego developmentalists appear to be claiming is that there is a synthetic function. That synthetic function is called the ego, and the ego's job is to pull together thinking, feeling, and motivation in coherent meaning-making structures. So I think there are actually some important differences between the two, would be my sense, but I'd be curious to hear what Theo has to say about that.
I mean, there are some arms of cognitive developmental theory that have this thing called executive function that I think plays a role.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't completely understand everything about this question, but I don't think that this is just a labeling problem.
Yeah.
It's sort of a simple response.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to question 5. And the question there is, what develops in cognitive development? Theo, could you respond to that first up?
The network. The network is what develops in cognitive development. So it's how experience and our interpretation of experience and our actions on the world and the world's actions on us are connected through the neural network in our brain, how they're connected together through the neural network in our brain. And in order for that development to take place robustly, you have to create the kinds of environments that will make it possible for those connections to be made and for those connections to be optimized. And I think there's other stuff going on, but for me, that's the primary focus, that it is networks. It's networks that are developing.
And I wonder, Theo, before we go to Aiden to respond, because I think he might be just, oh no, here he is. But I was wanting to go back to Barrett's earlier question, and that is, what do we know about the development of the connectome and how to accelerate its healthy development beyond VCOL, LDMA skills, dopamine, opioid cycle?
Nothing. That all of the work that we've done leads us to the dopamine opioid cycle as the primary mechanism for learning, or motivational mechanism for learning. No one's come up with any other explanations for why little children learn to walk. You know, that's the fundamental mechanism. That mechanism is connected to the virtuous cycle of learning, which, you know, Piaget characterized as accommodation, assimilation, and a similar kind of cycle. And what the virtuous cycle of learning, the way that we conceive of it, just adds a component to that. It's that we do it consciously and that we reflect consciously so that we're in charge rather than just letting the system as it's designed take complete control. And then creating the rich environments in which it's possible to actually use that system optimally. I think those are the keys. Those are the keys to development, and we haven't discovered, anything else that really plays a role if you take those things into account. Now, I've made them sound really simple. They're not simple. An optimal environment is quite a difficult thing to create and make possible for everybody. And we certainly all don't have the same opportunity to engage in an optimal environment. But I think we understand fairly well what that actually means in terms of what an ideal educational system would look like, for example. It would be one that really supports the robust connection of that network in a way that creates a connectome rather than a storage place for facts. And in order to do that, you have to have a very different kind of education that's very VCOL rich in order to accommodate, the way that the brain really works.
Thank you. Aiden, would you like to add anything to that? The question being, what develops in cognitive development?
I mean, I don't know, there's a lot more to add to that, to be honest. I mean, it seems to me as if that it's absolutely right to say that the underpinning thing that develops is the interconnectedness of the neural network, absolutely. And then that results in a number of different manifestations, right? And those manifestations are studied in different ways by different cognitive traditions. So for example, the way that the Piagetians and neo-Piagetians look at that particular manifestation is, it results in increasing orders of abstraction over, long time periods, for example. But equally, in other kind of cognitive traditions, they're not necessarily interested in increasing orders of abstraction. They're interested in other kinds of things. So, for example, the better performance of working memory, for example, or the acquisition of language kind of skills, for example, or how the retrieval of information from long-term memory might change over time, for example. So I think there's lots of different ways to think about the way in which cognition develops specifically, and the way in which it changes in general. And I mean, Lectica has a particular interest in, a certain way of looking at these kind of things. But it would seem to me as if the kind of fundamental thing that's going on to which we can attribute all of those things is the interconnectedness of the neural network, absolutely. Which is why I think Theo's point before is so critical about the embodied learning. I can't remember who asked that question around, do we need to have a more integrative conception of learning? But whoever that was, thank you for asking that question, because that gives us an answer, gives us an opportunity to talk about it. Because that's really the key thing. It's the embodied learning which is going to create the conditions for an increasingly connected neural network. An increasingly connected neural network leads to different manifestations of cognitive development that will probably include more clear thinking, more complex thinking, and various other kind of manifestations. So yeah, I think we're completely aligned around that.
Thanks, Aiden. I might just bring in a question. I think I've got a couple of questions from Howard Drossman. So you may need to, these were a few minutes ago, maybe give Howard a little bit more context. But for now, Howard's question is, are we just arguing about the different skills and which skills are most important to each audience? If so, do they need to communicate or just understand that they are communicating about different research concerns?
So,
did you want to give any more context?
Aiden, do you think that the ego development community is talking about skills?
No. I mean, the ego development community, I don't believe so. No, that certainly doesn't come through
they are
clearly.
Talking about something different skill, and they would
the ego development. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. You go ahead. You go.
No, and that they would say they were looking at something different. I think they wouldn't like being characterized as.
I'm pretty sure that the ego developmentalists would not want their work to be characterized as a development of a skill. They want their work to be characterized as either the development of the ego itself or the development of different worldviews. And that I think that the way that they would think about that is that skills are kind of smaller constructs than worldviews. Yeah, so I don't.
Or less valuable, less worthy of attention.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, they do make some kinds of claims that are parallel to claims that are made in the cognitive developmental tradition, as you pointed out in your research.
Yes.
Find evidence that they're actually doing anything but talking about those things. That we're not really seeing evidence that that's the real focus of their attention.
Right.
So,
Well,
I mean,
that's
there's always a possibility in any research that that because you're playing a different language game, that you might not be hearing each other, and you can't see where the overlap is.
Yeah.
I think that's always a risk, and it's worth looking, frequently to ask yourself the question: am I doing that?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, I think that what ego developmentalists and cognitive developmentalists have in common is both of them are claiming to have a scale of increasing complexity. What they have that makes them different is that cognitive developmentalists think that skills are the things that develop through that scale, whereas ego developmentalists believe that worldviews or egos are the things that develop through that scale. Yeah.
Kind of linked to Howard's.
Oops. Sorry, you and I should be competing for the floor.
I wish we were in the same room. It would make this a lot easier. There's almost this little wonderful way.
So can I just have one more thing that I wanted to say on that point, if we have time, and if we don't have time, just shut me down.
No, keep going.
Okay, and that is that, there is another really different way of looking at this question about what's develops in cognitive development, and it's probably worth it to say that you could also answer that question by saying skills, or you could answer that question by saying meaning. It depends on what angle you're looking at things from. And I always often feel like what we're doing here is we're trying to look at it in a bunch of different ways in order to be able to see it. So we're looking at it through the structure of arguments. And Aiden and I were just talking about this recently. We look at it through the structure of arguments. We look at it through the way that meanings change over time. So the developmental dictionary that is cataloging and that taxonomy of how meanings evolve and change over time. We look at it through the lens of the developing skill, and how those skills relate to one another. But really, those are the things that we can see. And my answer was, what's happening under there. My answer was to the what's happening under there question. But there are many lenses, and I think we should try to remember when we're distinguishing between a lens and what's actually happening under.
Which I think links to Howard's second question that he's posted. Might new worldviews allow us to differentiate among networks?
I don't know what it means.
I'm not sure, I don't understand that question.
So Howard, would you like to give us a little more context to that question?
Yeah. Theo said that all learning is networks. So if there are networks, that means there are sub-networks, right? There are groups of networks that come together to make a full network. And I think one of the issues we have when we're learning is we have many of these sub-networks and we don't see how they organize relative to one another. And one way of going to complexity, for instance, when you get to the principles level, you can integrate many abstractions together that you couldn't see were related before. When you have a new worldview and you see the world through a different set of lenses, this allows you to bring networks that were apparently unconnected to make them connected. So I think this idea of differentiating between worldviews and this is actually maybe a false dichotomy. I think the idea of developing worldviews allows one to connect different networks together more effectively and more efficiently, in a way, going to a set of principles that you never saw before. So that was the essence of where I was going with that.
Well, I think maybe we're thinking about networks a little bit differently. And also it depends on whether you're talking about this kind of developmental progress or you're talking about development at the micro level. Because fundamentally, if learning is about networks, it's about connecting, making multiple connections. So a new experience happens and I'm making multiple connections, probably across many different areas. Some of them are emotional connections, some of them are connections to a certain kind of idea, and others connections to other kinds of ideas. So, and this is a dynamic process. The networks aren't individual and located in special areas things, they're more dynamic than that. So that anytime we learn something new, we're restructuring the network. And it's what we're seeing when we look at development at the larger scale is the evidence of that ongoing process. And that looks differently if you look at it at different slices across that continuum. So there's not that something new happening when you move from abstract systems to single principles. It's the same kind of process taking place. It's just that you've arrived at a place where we can see something that looks different.
Coming to a Piagetian view, though, we see that these are not linear. They're not continuous, right? There are jumps in these things. So the question is, in the adult, can we have those jumps? I'm sorry.
We do not have jumps in the things. We do not have jumps in them. We're able to model data that shows that there's some kind of discontinuousness about them in the sense they're different from one another. But that is not the same thing as evidence that that's the way people develop. There's, that development is dynamic and it's ongoing, and there's not really good evidence out there that there's some kind of jump that happens in us individually as we move from one level to another. In fact, I would argue that the evidence that we look at shows us that when people make a transition that's smoother and gentler, they usually make that transition more successfully than they do if they have some kind of jerky transition going on that seems to be, looks like it's faster, but really ends up taking longer to get through because you're trying to jump over something you needed in order to get there robustly. So yeah, I don't really believe in stages anymore. Not in the sense that they're out there, that they're real. There'll have to be some really good evidence in the brain for me to really buy back into that again. Because we just don't see it in human performance.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point though. Yeah, because there is a big difference between talking about stages being qualitatively distinct, like qualitatively distinct ways of thinking, versus, someone waking up in the morning and finding themselves in a new stage of development, and their phenomenal, their whole worldview is suddenly, do you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing generally doesn't.
And Piaget didn't believe that.
So much, yeah.
Piaget did not believe that.
No, that's right. Exactly.
Matter of fact, the stages were heuristic devices. He just intended them to be places where he could illustrate things he was observing. We made them into stages. We made it to be a contest to get higher. That wasn't his goal.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Good. Deb, you're on mute if you're talking to us.
Thank you. Sorry, the dog was just barking at the delivery guy, so I took myself off mute. So what I was saying is that let's move on to question 6. And Susan, I see that you've posted a question in the chat window, which I think relates to this. So let's let Theo and Aiden respond to this, and then we'll come to your question, and then we'll have some time for more open questions as well. So the final question is, which developmental models align with Lectica's approach to cognitive development? So Aiden, would you like to respond to that first, and then we'll hand over to Theo?
Sure. Maybe I might just quickly screen share a little page from Lectica's website, actually, just for a second. If that's all right.
Yep.
So, whoops, can you see my screen?
Yep. It's
Perfect.
a little bit, yeah.
Oh, if you can't see it, then I'll just take it off the screen share. That's okay.
No, it's okay. We just have to peer a bit closer for those of us whose eyesight isn't as good as it once was.
Okay, yeah. Well, maybe we can send out this. Maybe we can send out this link in a follow-up email. But anyway,
a little bit maybe. I think that there's a little room for a little zoom in, maybe.
Oh, you reckon? Is this a little zoom?
Yeah, that's better.
That's good.
Yeah. Well, so these are amongst some of the models that align well with Lectica's approach. So you can see here over on the far left-hand side, lectical levels. And in part, lectical levels were originally informed by Fisher's dynamic skill scale and Michael Common's model of hierarchical complexity, all of which are domain-free developmental scales that can be used to understand the way in which reasoning happens in any domain in which we can do reasoning. And there's very sound empirical evidence that shows that these levels are well aligned to Kohlberg's moral reasoning, Armand's good life, Kitchener and King's reflective judgment, Keegan's I just had a mental blank. I've just forgotten the name of his theory. Not the evolution of the self. What's it called? I've just had a mental blank. It'll come to me in a second. Sorry, Bob Keegan.
Different ego development stages in a sense as well. I mean, there's social.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And there's also, some preliminary evidence that might suggest that there's some alignment with some of the Jacquian strata, but that's probably a slightly separate set of considerations.
And we don't actually have real evidence that the Keegan's theories align in the same way that we have evidence that
right.
Models align, because we haven't been able to actually do an actual comparison.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Yet, which I think on Aiden's to-do list.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. Well, that's right. And so we look. I mean, we do need some more empirical evidence to suggest that Keegan's stages align. Having said that, though, there certainly seems to be some sound reasons to think that there's probably some alignment. I mean, in The Evolving Self, for example, Keegan talks about, the ways in which his model was based on some Piagetian concepts, that he believed that it was also aligned with Kohlberg's stages of moral judgment, for example. There's been some kind of preliminary evidence that might suggest that his stages do increase in hierarchical complexity and so forth. But I think what some of you may notice is, again, the ego development stages are missing from here, and also a spiral dynamic stages. And that's probably because those two models don't very well align with this way of thinking about cognitive development. What all of these models have in common is that each stage or each level represents a qualitatively distinct and increasingly complex way of reasoning about the world, in a way that ego development and spiral dynamics doesn't necessarily seem to be. So when it comes to ego development, for example, we can probably have a broader conversation about that some other time, but my PhD dissertation was actually looking at a comparative analysis between the cognitive developmental tradition and the ego development tradition, or at least part of it was. And overwhelmingly, my conclusions showed that ego development stages don't actually increase in complexity, either in theory or in measurement. And so there's really no way to map an ego development stage to a stage of cognitive complexity, because they just don't really go together. In terms of spiral dynamics, actually, maybe this is something that Theo can talk about, because I think you and Katie Heikkinen wrote an article that looked at some very tentative and preliminary evidence, where you looked at a couple of leadership decisions. And I think you said that when there were two decisions, one that would have been called kind of orange in spiral dynamics terms, and the other would have been called green in spiral dynamics terms. And so from a spiral dynamics conception, the green one would have been considered higher or more developed, whereas in fact on the lectical scale, it was exactly the opposite. And in fact, the orange one was actually seemed to contain more complexity than the green one. It's been a while since I've read that article, so I may have misrepresented it, but I think it was something along those lines.
Yeah.
So
we were just going to use as examples. I think it was a
right.
Example.
Yeah.
Not really evidence, just example.
Right. Some preliminary considerations, though. Yeah. So really, I mean, I think the answer to this is it's the kind of models that look at the way that sensory motor actions develop in childhood and the way that reasoning develops in adulthood. They are the kind of models that are most likely going to be aligning with the lectical scale. And they include these ones listed on this table here. So I might just come off screen share now so I can see you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, and really, I think it's important to acknowledge too that the lectical scale really is the skill scale. It's the scale that Fisher spent many years working on. We've made it possible to do measurement along the scale more precisely. That's been one of the contributions that we've actually made to that process. So it's in some ways it's not the same scale because of the additional precision, and we've added the component of creating this taxonomy of meanings to this as well, which is bringing a different kind of lens into the developmental tradition. It's a new way of thinking about and looking at development that I think is going to end up contributing a great deal to our ability to really understand more about how learning actually takes place in the brain, how meanings get built up and constructed over time. We are looking for people writing dissertations who are interested in playing this in this sense.
Absolutely, yeah. The one thing that I would just say, just real quickly though, is I think, sometimes we say things that sound like this, right? Reasoning skills are the things that develop through developmental levels. And the way that some people hear that is they think we're saying reasoning skills are the only thing that people need, are the only things that are important. Reasoning skills are the only thing that leaders have to work on and so forth. And that's certainly not a claim that I'm making, and I certainly don't think it's a claim that Lectica is making, although Theo can clarify that for us in a second. Reasoning skills are...
looks at the series that we're writing, it's breaking down the skills, we'll be able to see that that's not what we're doing.
Yeah, no, exactly, yeah. So reasoning skills are important, absolutely, yes. And in fact, reasoning skills are one of the strongest predictors of workplace performance. They're one of the strongest predictors of leadership effectiveness.
We could observe, right? We could see them. So that's why we chose to look at them. Yeah.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. So there's good reasons for focusing on reasoning skills, and there's good reasons for saying that reasoning skills are the things that develop through developmental levels. That does not mean that we're saying that reasoning skills are the only thing that's important, is the only thing that leaders need, is the only model you need to use when you're doing leader development and so forth. That's certainly not a claim that's being made.
And we don't actually say that much anymore. I mean, you know,
Right.
15 years ago, we were saying that we're looking
Right.
at, but now we're more likely to say that we're looking at the development of meaning, or the development in particular of skills, because it turns out that Fisher was right to call it the skill scale. It really works. Yeah.
So before we go on to the next question, I just wanted to alert you folks that Barrett Brown has posted some information about Michael Commons and a new adult development Google group. So if you want to get more involved in that, Barrett's kindly put his email address in there. And further back in the chat, Becky put a link into a deep dialogue that's happening this evening. So if you want to participate in those, please avail yourself of the information in the chat window. Let's go to Susan's question, and I'll ask you to respond to this first, Theo. How can cognitive developmentalists do a better job of communicating their findings and recommendations to educators, K to 12, HE and beyond?
Good question.
I think it depends on what we're talking about. I mean, what kind of findings we're talking about. I think I have come to the conclusion that it's better really not to talk about developmental stages. What we've learned is that if we want practitioners to take up what we're doing, that for most practitioners, what you want to give them are things they can do that will help support development. That, you know, trying to do a short course on how development works, you know, with some, you know, I mean, it took me, you know, years in university to come to understand it, even slightly robustly. When we start trying to teach people about developmental levels, they just always get it wrong. And because they've misunderstood, they're likely to do something that's even worse than what they were doing before. We've kind of laid a framework on their previous work that's made them think that now they know something better than what they knew before, when in fact they haven't actually learned something new. So we're really focusing we're focusing on, and if you look at our new assessments and the new reports that are coming out, the feedback is all about actions that you can take to develop. And I think that putting that in people's hands, actions you can take to develop, things you can actually do, is probably the best thing that we can do in communicating. But then there's the other kind of buyer that is the academic buyer. And in that case, I think you have to do a different kind of a dialogue with them. But for most of the people that, you know, that are actually working in the trenches in the learning business, it's really about, give me some things that I can do. Give me things that I can do that are going to make a difference to the learning that's going on in my community. And that's where we're shifting the focus.
Thank you. Howard's just posted a question that we could talk about for a long time, I suspect. Is there some relation between development and transformation? Aiden, would you like to have a go at that?
Some relation between development and transformation. I mean, you know, again, I think it kind of touches on what we were saying before about the distinction between stages being qualitatively distinct and stages, therefore, I mean, let me put it this way. I think there's a distinction between the theory and the experience. The theory would suggest there's something transformational, that each stage is a transformation of the previous stage, and that each stage is a qualitatively distinct transformation. So that's transformational. From an internal phenomenological experience, as someone who might be teetering on, you know, the edge of one phase to the next phase and so forth, I don't know that it really feels transformational, really. You know, I mean, yes, there are aha moments. Yes, there are deep insights. Yes, there are connections that we make. And, you know, sometimes in the privacy of our own mind, or when we're doing our journaling practice at night before we go to bed, you know, something dawns on us that we never considered before, and so forth. So, I mean, I suppose you could consider that to be transformational in some sense, yes. But I don't think it's as transformative as it's sometimes described, particularly in some of the practitioners' literature. I don't know. What do you think, Theo, about that?
I like the way that you kind of brought a slightly different lens on this, and I've thought about it through before. I kind of think that what people are talking about when they're talking about, you know, I went on this weekend and it was a totally transformational experience.
Oh yeah.
Is that they had an emotional experience of some kind. But I think there's lots of different kinds of ways that can happen. For example, I have lots of eureka moments. And I experience those as transformational because they mean I understand something differently than I did before. And personally, I get very excited to the point where it's annoying to other people when that happens. I think that those moments are actually transformative moments. Like when you go, aha, I got it. Now, unfortunately, what often happens is you lose it right away again, and you have to go and try to get it again. But you know, you're addicted then, and you're willing to go back and keep going after it until you get it. I think that usage of that term transformation makes sense. Like maybe we should stop calling them aha moments, and we should start calling them, you know, transformation moments.
Yeah.
But I also think that the kind of transformation, when people talk about transformation, that there's lots of other kinds of things that can cause you to feel emotions that feel like something transformative happened. I don't want to take that away from anybody because it's a really cool thing to feel, and it's probably not damaging.
But I suspect that you could probably have those transformational moments without anything developmental necessarily happening, right?
Yeah, I think it happens just because it's like, I mean, I've had moments in a church, for example, when everybody's singing together, where you just feel like you're transcending something, you know, like there's something, you're not just you by yourself anymore, you're part of something bigger. That's not a developmental moment, but it's a transcending moment. It feels transformative. You feel like a different person in that moment.
Yeah.
So Barrett's offered us a new word. Thank you, Barrett. Transfo-ments. Transfo-ments.
Yeah, that's a new hashtag, everybody. Get onto it. That's it. Yeah.
All right, folks.
Sorry, you and I seem to just always want to say something at the same time.
Go ahead, Theo.
You can go, because I think it's important to have the person who's in charge go.
No, I was just going to start wrapping up, so you better get in.
That's what I was thinking. It's probably time to wrap up, and I should.
But we've got a couple of minutes, so go right ahead.
I've already forgotten what I was going to say.
Oh.
You guys, honestly.
No, I'll pay the check. No, I'll pay the check. No,
that's right, exactly.
Here we go. Here's another question. Aiden, are you going to share your note? This is from Howard. Share your notes from the first series that you did. And by the way, folks, if you weren't there, I think it was 9 weeks, 2 hours a week. So it was a pretty full-on lecture series. So there's not a short, pithy answer to that. But go ahead, Aiden.
Yes, so I kind of. Look, I've had a lot of requests for other people to engage with the research, and so I'm just in conversation with Theo about how we do that in a more abbreviated format. Last time it took 3 months to explain it, and I'm trying to do it in a slightly more efficient way. So the answer is there will be other forums to engage. Yes.
Oh gosh, there were scholars in the room who were very jealous because getting 9 weeks to tell your story is a gift. If you want to present at a conference, you got to get it down to 15 minutes.
Yeah, I know that's a tough ask.
But it needed those 9 weeks. I mean, there was so much in there, and you know, we're indebted to Aiden and you, Theo, standing on the shoulders of giants that have come before you to offer this work. So you know, it's we're very, very well. At least I am very, very grateful to you. So we'll do a few things to wrap up so that we can finish on time. So yeah, mega thanks to Theo and Aiden for their time this morning and for continuing these kind of dialogues. So Shanti has all of your email addresses, and the dialogues are going to continue in 2 types of forms. We have roundtable dialogues, which are more of the pragmatic application of Lectica tools and assessments, and case studies and actual real live clients talking about how they've used Lectica's work. So that's called the round table. And this discussion here is called an Institute Dialogue. And Shanti will send you emails on both of those, and there's a calendar of events. So please make sure when you get that communication that you look through the topics and reserve your spot for ones that are of most interest to you. Shanti, is there anything else you wanted to say about that?
Nope, we're gonna process this video and send out that email when the video is ready. So that's not gonna be tonight or first thing in the morning, but you will get it.
Yep, terrific, thank you. And thanks, Shanti, for being the operational backbone of what's going on here and doing what is absolutely necessary to have these events being hosted. So we hope that you've enjoyed the session today, and please join us again next month for what promises to be a stimulating conversation regarding modernism and postmodernism. And the focusing question is postmodernism a developmental stage beyond modernism? So if that piques your interest, come along. It's bound to be intellectually stimulating and juicy.
I can't wait for that one. Yeah.
Sorry, Aiden?
Oh, I can't wait for that one.
Absolutely. Finally, what we'd like you to do before you head off is I'm just posting in the chat window a couple of statements, and if you can fill in your response to those statements before you go, that would be great. And the two statements are I liked ... or I wish ... So as you're sort of signing off, if you can put a couple of comments in there, that would be helpful. Lectica absolutely do thrive on feedback. So if there's something that you would like more of, or you that wish would have happened in this session, then please put your comments in there, and Lectica will take that on board and integrate your comments into future sessions wherever possible. So I think that's it from us. Thank you everyone for coming along. All the best for a very safe and happy festive season. So hope to see you all next time.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. And thank you, Deborah.
Thanks, Deb.
My pleasure.